a queen allegedly had her lovers thrown from a tower after their trysts. Another queen openly took a lover and then helped him invade her own husband's kingdom, and, well, let's just say the king didn't make it. And imagine a brilliant philosopher and his student falling madly in love, only for her enraged uncle to order a brutal, very personal revenge that echoed for centuries. Get ready, because medieval high society was a tangled web of power, passion, and some seriously shocking secrets. Number 11. The Queen who ditched England for her first love and caused a royal headache. Picture this. You're Isabella of Angoulême. You're young, beautiful, and you're all set to marry a handsome French nobleman, Hugh de Lusignan. Life looks pretty sweet, right then? BAM. King John of England, known for not being the nicest guy, think Magna Carta drama, swoops in. He decides he wants you, even though you're already betrothed. And what King John wants, King John usually gets. So, in 1200, young Isabella, probably barely a teenager, found herself married to the King of England. Talk about a change of plans. Hugh de Lusignan was, understandably, not thrilled. He'd been publicly jilted, and in medieval times, that was a big ouch to your honor. This move by King John also seriously upset a lot of French nobles, and even helped kick off more conflict between England and France. Smooth move, John. Isabella became Queen of England. She and John had 5 children, including the future King Henry III. But their marriage, sources hint it wasn't exactly a fairy tale. John was known for his temper and his wandering eye. Isabella, on the other hand, was described as beautiful, but also as having a bit of a fiery spirit herself. Some chroniclers even whispered that she had her own affairs, though concrete proof is hard to come by. Fast forward to 1216. King John dies. Isabella is now a dowager queen, still relatively young, around 30. What's a former queen to do? Well, Isabella decided to go back to France, back to her home region of Angoulême. And guess who was still around? Yep, Hugh de Lusignan, her original fiancé. He was now Hugh X, Lord of Lusignan. In a move that probably made a few jaws drop, Isabella married Hugh in 1220. Some said it was true love finally triumphing. Others probably muttered about a queen marrying a lesser noble, even if he was a powerful lord in his own right. It was definitely unusual. She was, after all, the mother of the King of England. Her new marriage meant her English children and her new French children would be half-siblings, creating some complicated loyalties. But the scandal didn't stop there. Isabella and Hugh had a whole brood of Lusignan kids. They were ambitious, and Isabella, with her royal background, wasn't about to just quietly settle down. She and Hugh got into some serious political tiffs with the French crown. Isabella reportedly felt disrespected by the French queen and encouraged Hugh to rebel. She even got her son, King Henry III of England, involved in supporting their cause, which didn't go too well for him. Chroniclers painted her as a bit of a troublemaker, a Jezebel type, especially after she was implicated in a supposed plot to poison the French king. Whether that was true or just nasty gossip because she was a powerful woman challenging authority, who knows? But it certainly added to her scandalous reputation. She ended up retiring to Fontefraud Abbey, where Eleanor of Aquitaine was buried. Fun fact, and died there in 1246. From queen to controversial countess, Isabella of Angoulême certainly didn't lead a boring life. Number 10. The king, his brother, and a whole lot of angry nobles. Let's talk about King Edward II of England. He reigned in the early 1300s, and to say his time on the throne was a bit rocky would be an understatement. A big part of the drama, his intense relationships with certain male favorites, particularly a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston. Piers Gaveston wasn't just any knight. He was charming, witty, and, by all accounts, King Edward II was utterly smitten with him from a young age, even before he became king. Edward showered Gaveston with titles, lands, and power, making him Earl of Cornwall, a title usually reserved for royalty. He even left Gaveston as regent of England when he went to France to marry Isabella. Yes, that Isabella, daughter of the French king, who we'll hear more about later. Now, kings having favorites wasn't new. But the intensity of Edward's affection for Gaveston and the sheer amount of influence Gaveston seemed to have really rubbed the powerful English barons the wrong way. They saw Gaveston as an upstart, arrogant, and a bad influence on the king. They grumbled that Edward preferred Gaveston's company to, well, pretty much everyone else, including his own queen. Some chroniclers described their relationship with words like excessive and inordinate. Edward even called Gaveston his brother. Was it a romantic, sexual relationship? Many historians think so, based on the language used in contemporary chronicles, even though those chroniclers were often hostile. Whether it was or wasn't, it looked like it to a lot of people, and it was definitely perceived as a threat to the established order. The barons felt Gaveston was monopolizing royal patronage and disrespecting them. Gaveston, in turn, apparently loved to mock the powerful nobles, giving them rude nicknames. Not a great way to make friends, Piers. The situation got so bad that the barons forced Edward to exile Gaveston not once, but multiple times. Each time, Edward would be heartbroken and would scheme to bring him back, showering him with more gifts upon his return. This cycle just made the barons angrier. They felt the king was putting his personal feelings for Gaveston above the good of the kingdom. Eventually, the barons had enough. In 1312, led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, Edward's cousin, a group of nobles captured Gaveston. Despite promises of safety, they held a sham trial and executed him. Some accounts say he was beheaded, others that he was run through with a sword. Edward was devastated and furious, and this act poisoned his relationship with his nobility for years. But did Edward learn his lesson about favorites? Not really. Later in his reign, he became extremely close to another duo, Hugh Despenser, the younger, and his father. And guess what? The nobles hated them too, for pretty much the same reasons. Too much power, too much influence, and perceived arrogance. This pattern of intense favoritism, whether purely platonic or romantic, created massive instability and was a huge part of the scandals that plagued Edward II's reign, ultimately contributing to his own rather grim end. Number 9. The queen who ruled like a king and loved like one too. Meet Urraca of Leon and Castile, a queen who reigned in the early 12th century. And let's just say she was not your typical medieval damsel. She was a queen regnant, meaning she ruled in her own right, not just as a king's wife. And she was a force to be reckoned with. Urraca inherited the throne from her father, Alfonso VI, in 1109. This was already a big deal, as female rulers were rare. She was married, for political reasons, to Alfonso I of Aragon, a guy known as the Battler. Sounds like a match made in, well, not heaven. Their marriage was notoriously stormy. They were both strong-willed, and they clashed, big time. We're talking actual military clashes between their supporters. Now, here's where it gets extra scandalous for the time. Urraca wasn't shy about taking lovers. And not just discreetly. One of her most prominent lovers was Count Gomez Gonzalez. Their affair was pretty open, and he was a key supporter of hers against her husband. When Gomez was killed in battle, chroniclers noted Urraca's deep grief. But the lover who really got tongues wagging was Count Pedro González de Lara. Their relationship was long-lasting, and they even had 2 children together. This was happening while she was still technically married to Alfonso the Battler, though they were often estranged and fighting, and later, after their marriage was annulled. For a queen to openly have children with a man who wasn't her husband, that was major gossip fuel. Urraca didn't seem to care much what people thought. She needed allies, and these powerful noblemen provided that. She also clearly had her own desires and wasn't afraid to act on them. She was a queen trying to hold onto her power in a world dominated by men, and she used all the tools at her disposal, including alliances cemented by personal relationships. Her reign was full of conflict with her husband, with her own ambitious half-sister Teresa of Portugal, and even with her own son, the future Alfonso VII. Some church officials were horrified by her lifestyle and the political instability. They weren't keen on a queen who seemed to defy all conventions, especially when it came to her personal life. Imagine the sermons. But Urraca was a survivor. She managed to navigate these treacherous waters, keeping her kingdoms largely intact. She outmaneuvered her husband, eventually securing an annulment. They were conveniently second cousins, which provided the grounds. She fought, she schemed, she loved. When she died in 1126, she left the throne to her son, Alfonso VII, from her first, less scandalous marriage to Raymond of Burgundy, who had died before she became queen. Urraca's life was a testament to a woman wielding power in a man's world, and her open affairs were just one part of her refusal to be a quiet, subservient queen. She was a ruler, and she lived and loved on her own terms, much to the shock of many of her contemporaries. Number 8, the Queen, the murder plot, and a whole lot of husbands. Step right up for the dramatic and often blood-soaked tale of Joanna I, Queen of Naples, who reigned in the mid-14th century. Her life had it all: power, intrigue, multiple marriages and persistent scandalous rumors of murder and illicit affairs. Joanna became Queen of Naples, Sicily, and Jerusalem, a fancy title, as a teenager in 1343, inheriting a kingdom that was already a bit of a hotbed of political rivalry. Her first husband was Andrew, Duke of Calabria, a Hungarian prince. Their marriage was arranged, and by all accounts, it was not a happy one. Andrew wanted to be king, not just the Queen's husband, and he had his own supporters pushing for him. Joanna and her Neapolitan court weren't too keen on that. Then, in 1345, things took a very dark turn. He was found strangled and thrown from a balcony at a hunting lodge. Who did it? Well, that's the million-florin question. Suspicion immediately fell on Joanna and her circle, including members of her extended family and some of her courtiers. Rumors swirled that Joanna herself was involved, wanting to get rid of her troublesome husband, perhaps to marry one of her lovers. One name that popped up as a suspected lover and conspirator was Louis of Taranto, Joanna's cousin. And guess what? Not long after Andrew's death, Joanna married Louis. This did not look good. It basically screamed, "We killed him so we could be together." To many observers, especially Andrew's very angry brother, King Louis I of Hungary. King Louis of Hungary was convinced of Joanna's guilt and invaded Naples to avenge his brother. Joanna and her new husband, Louis of Taranto, had to flee. It was a messy, drawn-out conflict. Joanna eventually went to Avignon, where the Pope was based, to plead her case. In a famous trial, she was actually acquitted of Andrew's murder, partly because she argued she was too young and influenced by others, and partly due to some clever political maneuvering. She sold Avignon to the Pope, which probably helped her case. Joanna managed to regain her kingdom, but her life remained turbulent. After Louis of Taranto died, she married again, this time to James IV, King of Majorca. That marriage also had its issues. And then, after James died, she married again to Otto, Duke of Brunswick-Grubenhagen. 4 husbands. That alone was enough to raise eyebrows in an era where a widowed queen might be expected to retire to a convent. Throughout her reign, Joanna was often portrayed by her enemies as decadent and immoral. The shadow of Andrew's murder never fully left her. Was she a ruthless killer who disposed of her husband for love and power? Or was she a young queen caught in a web of deadly court politics, a convenient scapegoat for ambitious nobles? Historians still debate it. Her end was as dramatic as her life. She got caught up in the Western Schism, a period with multiple rival popes, and backed the wrong pope. Her adopted heir, Charles of Durazzo, another cousin, medieval royal families were complicated, turned against her, invaded Naples with Hungarian support. They never forgot Andrew, captured her, and had her imprisoned. In 1382, Joanna was assassinated in her prison, likely strangled, an eerie echo of her first husband's fate. Her reign was a whirlwind of passion, politics, and accusations that kept Europe buzzing for decades. Number 7. The king's secret rose and the queen's jealousy, or so the story goes. Let's dive into one of England's most romantic and enduring legends, King Henry II, and his Fair Rosamund. Henry II, who reigned in the mid-12th century, was a powerful and energetic king, married to the equally formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine. Their marriage was a political powerhouse, but it was also famously stormy, filled with ambitions, betrayals, and yes, affairs. Henry had several mistresses, but none captured the popular imagination quite like Rosamund Clifford. Rosamund was the daughter of a marcher, Lord Walter de Clifford. The exact timeline of her affair with Henry is a bit hazy, but it likely began while Queen Eleanor was often busy governing her own lands in Aquitaine, or was otherwise occupied. Henry, it seems, was quite taken with Rosamund. She was reportedly very beautiful, earning her the nickname Rosamundi, Rose of the World, by some, though others said it was more like Rosa Immundi, unchaste rose. The legend really takes off with the idea that Henry, to protect his beloved Rosamund from the famously jealous Queen Eleanor, built a secret hiding place for her at Woodstock Palace. This wasn't just any hiding place. It was said to be a complex labyrinth, or a bower, so cleverly designed that only Henry, or someone with a special clue, like a silken thread, could find his way to Rosamund. Romantic, right? Or maybe just a bit extra. Now, did Queen Eleanor really try to hunt down Rosamund? This is where history and legend get really tangled. The popular story, which gained traction centuries later, is that Eleanor, consumed by rage and jealousy, finally navigated the maze, or tricked Rosamund into revealing the way. She then confronted her rival and offered her a choice, a dagger or a bowl of poison. In these tales, Rosamund tragically chose, or was forced to take, the poison. It's a dramatic story, but historians generally agree it's probably not true. There's no contemporary evidence that Eleanor poisoned Rosamund. In reality, Rosamund Clifford retired to Godstone Nunnery near Oxford, likely when the affair ended, or when Henry wanted to reconcile with Eleanor, or perhaps when Rosamund herself sought a more pious life. She died there around 1176, still fairly young. Henry and his family did pay for a lavish tomb for her at Godstow, and she was venerated there for a while, much to the annoyance of some church officials who didn't think a king's mistress deserved such honors. Bishop Hugh of Lincoln famously ordered her remains to be moved from the church to the ordinary cemetery. So, why was this affair so scandalous, even if the poisoning part is fiction? Well, adultery by a king was hardly uncommon. But the romance attached to Rosamund, the idea of her being the king's great true love hidden away, made it a particularly juicy story. It highlighted Henry's infidelities at a time when his marriage to Eleanor was already under immense strain due to power struggles and their sons' rebellions, which Eleanor supported against Henry. The legend of Fair Rosamund and the jealous queen became a cautionary tale and a source of romantic tragedy for centuries. It painted Eleanor as a vindictive fury, which might not have been entirely fair, but it certainly made for a better story. The affair, real or embellished, became a symbol of forbidden love and the dangerous passions that could simmer beneath the surface of royal courts. Number 6. The king, his mistress, and her unbelievable power trip. Imagine being the mistress of an aging king. Now imagine using that position to become one of the wealthiest and most influential women in the country, much to the fury of, well, almost everyone else. Meet Alice Perrers, the notorious mistress of King Edward III of England in the latter part of his reign during the mid-14th century. Edward III was a celebrated king for much of his rule, known for his early victories in the 100 Years' War. But as he got older, and especially after his capable wife, Queen Philippa of Hainault, died in 1369, things started to change. Edward's health declined, and he seemed to become more reliant on those around him. And who was right there ready to step into the void? Alice Perrers. Alice wasn't from a super high-ranking noble family. She had been a lady-in-waiting to Queen Philippa. How she caught the king's eye isn't entirely clear, but by the early 1370s she was firmly established as his mistress. And she wasn't just a quiet companion. Oh no! Alice was ambitious, clever, and apparently very good at getting what she wanted. She amassed a huge fortune in lands and jewels, often gifts from the besotted king. But she didn't stop there. Alice started to meddle in politics and legal affairs. People complained that she would even sit on the judges' benches, influencing court cases for her own benefit or for those who paid her. Can you imagine the outrage? Here was this woman, not royal, not even a high-born aristocrat, seemingly calling the shots in the king's name. Parliament, especially the Good Parliament of 1376, had a massive problem with Alice. They saw her as corrupt, greedy, and a symbol of everything that was going wrong with the aging king's government. They accused her of manipulating the senile king for her own gain and of flouting all sorts of conventions. She was even formally banished from court, and her lands were confiscated, a huge public rebuke. The scandal wasn't just about a king having a mistress. That was pretty standard. It was about the power this mistress wielded. She was seen as usurping royal authority. Chroniclers of the time had a field day painting her in the most unflattering terms. They said she was grasping, arrogant, and that she only cared about money. Some stories even claimed she waited until the king was on his deathbed, then stripped the rings from his fingers and fled. Probably an exaggeration, but it shows how much she was disliked. Did Alice have any redeeming qualities? Some historians suggest she was also a savvy businesswoman, and that she provided genuine companionship to the aging and unwell king. She also had children with Edward III, though they weren't legitimized. After Edward III died in 1377, Alice's fortunes took a hit. The banishment order from the Good Parliament was enforced by the new regime under Richard II, Edward's grandson. She fought to get her property back, and she did manage to recover some of it eventually. She even married a nobleman, Sir William Windsor, who had been Lieutenant of Ireland. Alice Perrers's story is a classic tale of a royal mistress who flew too close to the sun. Her affair with Edward III became scandalous, not just because of the sex, but because of the incredible, and to many outrageous influence she wielded over the king in the kingdom. She became a symbol of late-reign corruption, and a warning about what could happen when a low-born woman got too much power. Number 5. The Duke, his decades-long love, and the kids who became kings. This isn't just any affair. This is a love story that spanned decades, produced a brood of famous children, and eventually, incredibly, ended in marriage, with their descendants shaping the future of the English monarchy. We're talking about John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, one of the most powerful men in 14th century England, and his longtime mistress, Catherine Swynford, John of Gaunt was a son of King Edward III. Yes, the same Edward who had Alice Perrers as a mistress-busy family. John was a major political player, immensely wealthy, and a key figure during the reign of his young nephew, Richard II. He was married twice for political and dynastic reasons. First to Blanche of Lancaster, who he genuinely seemed to love, and after her death to Constance of Castile, which brought him a claim to a Spanish throne. Catherine Swynford, born Catherine de Rote, originally came into the ducal household as a governess to John and Blanche's daughters. Her sister, Philippa de Rote, was married to the poet Geoffrey Chaucer. Small world. After Blanche's death in 1368, and while John was married to Constance, a deep and lasting affair began between John and Catherine. This wasn't a hidden, fleeting fling. It was a committed relationship that lasted for years, even decades. Catherine was John's companion, his confidant. And they had children together, 4 of them in fact, who were given the surname Beaufort. John openly acknowledged these children. He provided for them, educated them, and clearly cared for them deeply. Now, why was this scandalous? Well, for starters, John was married. Adultery, especially for such a high-profile figure, was always going to cause talk. And this wasn't just any duke. This was the king's uncle, a man with immense power and influence. His open, long-term relationship with Catherine, while his legitimate wife Constance was still alive, was a bold move. It flouted convention. There were periods when public pressure or political expediency forced John to publicly renounce Catherine. For instance, during the politically charged atmosphere of the Good Parliament, which also went after Alice Perrers, John's relationship with Catherine was criticized. He made a public show of separating from her. But their connection was too strong, and they always seemed to find their way back to each other. The truly astonishing part came later. Constance of Castile died in 1394. And then in 1396, John of Gaunt did something almost unheard of for a man of his station. He married Catherine Swynford. He married his long-term mistress, the mother of his illegitimate children. This was a massive deal. Some of the nobility were horrified. Marrying so far beneath his station, though Catherine was of gentle birth, she wasn't a princess or a great heiress, was seen as shocking. But John was powerful enough to do it. And he didn't stop there. He then sought to have their Beaufort children legitimized. He got a papal bull and a royal patent from King Richard II, declaring the Beauforts legitimate and able to inherit property. The patent did, however, try to bar them from the line of succession to the throne, though that clause, excepta dignitate regali, the royal dignity accepted, was a bit legally ambiguous, and possibly added later, without full authority. The consequences of this affair and eventual marriage were huge. The Beauforts became a powerful and influential family. John and Catherine's great-granddaughter, Margaret Beaufort, would become the mother of King Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch. So, yes, the blood of Catherine Swynford, the once scandalous mistress, flows in the veins of the British royal family to this day. Talk about a love affair with lasting impact. Number 4, the scholar, his student, and the love that led to mutilation. Get ready for one of the most famous, tragic, and intellectually charged love affairs of the entire Middle Ages. The story of Peter Abelard and Heloise d'Argenteau. This wasn't just a tale of forbidden passion. It was a meeting of brilliant minds that ended in brutal revenge and a lifetime of poignant correspondence. It all happened in Paris, in the early 12th century. Peter Abelard was a rock-star philosopher and theologian. He was brilliant, modoc, a bit arrogant, and students flocked to hear him lecture. He was at the cutting edge of intellectual thought. Heloise was a young woman living under the care of her uncle, Fulbert, a canon at Notre Dame Cathedral. And she wasn't just any young woman. She was exceptionally intelligent and learned, fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, highly unusual for a woman of her time. Fulbert, proud of his niece's intellect, wanted the best education for her. So he hired the most famous teacher in Paris, Peter Abelard, to be her live-in tutor. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as Abelard himself later wrote in his autobiographical Historia Calamitatum, the story of my misfortunes, he deliberately set out to seduce Heloise. He admitted he was driven by pride and lust. Under the guise of studying philosophy, their lessons soon turned to love. As Abelard put it, our hands strayed oftener to breasts than to books. They fell deeply, passionately in love. It was an affair of both mind and body. They were intellectual equals who found an irresistible attraction in each other. But, of course, it was scandalous. He was a famous cleric, though not yet a priest. He was in orders, and teacher. She was his young student under her uncle's protection. When Heloise became pregnant, the secret was out. To try and make things right, Abelard offered to marry Heloise secretly. He wanted to protect his career, as a married scholar would have fewer prospects in the church-dominated academic world. Heloise remarkably argued against marriage. She knew it would ruin Abelard's career. She even quoted classical authors on the burdens of marriage for a philosopher. She said she would rather be his mistress than his wife, to preserve his freedom and reputation. But Abelard insisted, and they were secretly married after their son, Astrolabe, cool name, right, was born. Uncle Fulbert, however, was not appeased by a secret marriage. He felt his family's honor had been betrayed, and he was furious. He started to spread the news of the marriage, which Abelard and Heloise had tried to keep quiet. Fearing for Heloise's safety, Abelard sent her to a convent at Argenteau. Fulbert interpreted this as Abelard trying to abandon Heloise and force her to become a nun. This was the final straw for Fulbert. He plotted a truly horrific revenge. One night, he hired men who broke into Abelard's room while he slept. They attacked him and castrated him. This brutal act effectively ended Abelard's ambitions for a high-ranking career in the church, and was a public humiliation of the most profound kind. The scandal was immense. Castration as a punishment, especially for a man of Abelard's stature, was shocking. After this, both Abelard and Heloise formally entered monastic life. He became a monk, she a nun. But their story didn't end there. Years later, they began a famous correspondence, a series of letters that are incredibly moving and provide a window into their enduring love, their regrets, and their intellectual connection. Heloise, in particular, wrote with raw honesty about her unbroken love for Abelard, questioning the nature of her religious vows when her heart still belonged to him. Their love affair, born in intellectual sparks and ending in tragedy and lifelong devotion, became a legend of passionate, forbidden love that resonates even now. Number 3. The Queen, her lover, and the King who met a nasty end. If you think royal drama is juicy now, wait until you hear about Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer. We're talking about a Queen of England who teamed up with her lover to overthrow her own husband, King Edward II. This story has everything: a neglected queen, a discontented nobleman, a daring escape, an invasion, and a king's very mysterious and probably gruesome death. Isabella of France, daughter of the powerful French king Philip IV, was married to Edward II of England in 1308. She was young, beautiful, and from a formidable royal line. Edward II. Well, we've already met him. He was the king who was famously devoted to his male favorites, like Piers Gaveston and later the Despensers. This meant Queen Isabella often felt neglected, humiliated, and politically sidelined. Her marriage was not a happy one. The Despensers, in particular, seemed to actively work to keep her away from power and influence, and they disrespected her. Roger Mortimer was a powerful English marcher lord from a prominent noble family. He'd initially been loyal to Edward II, but grew increasingly frustrated with the king's misrule and the overwhelming influence of the Despensers. He joined a baronial revolt, was captured, and thrown into the Tower of London. Things looked pretty bleak for him. But Mortimer was a resourceful guy. In 1323, he made a daring escape from the Tower, supposedly by drugging his guards, and fled to France. And who else happened to be in France around that time? Queen Isabella? She had been sent by Edward II on a diplomatic mission to her brother, King Charles IV of France, to sort out some issues over Gascony. Once in France, Isabella decided she wasn't going back to England as long as the Despensers held power. She publicly denounced them and effectively refused to return to her husband. It was around this time, in Paris, that Isabella and Roger Mortimer, both exiles with a common enemy, formed a political alliance and a personal one. They became lovers. This was incredibly scandalous. The Queen of England openly taking a lover while defying her husband and king, unthinkable. But Isabella was determined. She gathered support, including mercenaries, using her French connections and funds, some borrowed, some from her own dower rights. With Mortimer as her chief captain, she launched an invasion of England in 1326. Their invasion was surprisingly successful. The regime of Edward II and the Despensers had become so unpopular that many nobles and commoners flocked to Isabella and Mortimer's banner. The Despensers were captured and brutally executed. King Edward II fled, but was eventually captured and forced to abdicate his throne in favor of his young son, Edward III. Isabella and Mortimer would rule as regents. And what happened to Edward II? He was imprisoned, first at Kenilworth Castle, and then moved to Berkeley Castle. In September 1327, it was announced that he had died. The official cause of death was given as natural causes, but almost no one believed it. Rumors immediately spread that he had been murdered on the orders of Isabella and Mortimer, who couldn't risk him becoming a rallying point for opposition. The most infamous, and probably untrue but very persistent, rumor was that he was killed by having a red-hot poker inserted into his anus, a gruesome death that would leave no outward marks and was perhaps seen as a symbolic punishment for his alleged homosexuality. While historians doubt this specific method, most agree he was likely murdered. For a few years, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England. Mortimer became incredibly powerful and arrogant, styling himself Earl of March. But their regime became unpopular. Young King Edward III was growing up, and he wasn't content to be a puppet king. In 1330, Edward III staged a coup. He had Mortimer arrested, surprising him at Nottingham Castle, supposedly via a secret tunnel. Lots of secret tunnels in these stories. Roger Mortimer was accused of treason, including usurping royal power and complicity in Edward II's death. He was executed without a proper trial and hanged. Isabella, the she-wolf of France, as some later called her, was initially kept under a form of house arrest, but her son Edward III eventually treated her with respect. She lived out her days comfortably, but her scandalous affair and the dramatic overthrow and death of her husband became one of the most notorious episodes in English royal history. Number 2. When royal wives threw wild parties. That ended in torture and prison. This is a scandal that rocked the French royal family to its core and had consequences that rippled out for generations. It's known as the Tour de Nesle affair, and it involves adultery, betrayal, torture, and the highest levels of French nobility in the early 14th century. The setting? France, 1314. King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, was a stern, pious, and powerful ruler. He had 3 sons: Louis, the future Louis X, Philip, the future Philip V, and Charles, the future Charles IV. All 3 sons were married to high-ranking noblewomen. Louis was married to Margaret of Burgundy. Philip was married to Joan II, Countess of Burgundy, and Charles was married to Blanche of Burgundy, Joan's sister. Everything seemed set for a stable dynastic future, or so it seemed. The scandal erupted thanks to Isabella, King Philip IV's daughter, who was married to King Edward II of England. Yes, her again. She was clearly not one to ignore impropriety, or perhaps she was just good at stirring the pot. During a visit to Paris in 1314, Isabella reportedly gave beautifully embroidered purses to her sisters-in-law, Margaret and Blanche. Later, during the same visit, Isabella noticed these very same purses hanging from the belts of 2 handsome young Norman knights, brothers Philip d'Aunay and Walter d'Aunay, alarm bells. Isabella, perhaps out of genuine shock, perhaps with some political motive, or maybe just because she knew her father's strict nature, informed King Philip IV. The king, not known for his leniency, ordered a secret investigation. The princesses and the knights were watched. What the investigation supposedly uncovered was shocking. For up to 2 years, Margaret of Burgundy and Blanche of Burgundy had allegedly been carrying on adulterous affairs with Philip and Walter d'Aunay. Their secret meeting spot? The Tour de Nesle, a guard tower on the banks of the Seine in Paris. It was said to be the scene of their illicit trysts and parties. Joan of Burgundy, Margaret's sister-in-law and Blanche's sister, was accused of either participating in the affairs or at the very least knowing about them and keeping them secret. The Darnay brothers were arrested. Under torture, a standard medieval practice for extracting confessions, whether true or not, they confessed to the affairs. They reportedly admitted to meeting the princesses at the Tour de Nesle and other places over a significant period. The public scandal was enormous. Royal princesses committing adultery. This wasn't just a personal failing. It had serious dynastic implications. Were any children born to Margaret or Blanche legitimate? Could their husbands trust the bloodline? The honor of the French royal house was deeply stained. The Tour de Nesle affair had long-lasting consequences. It cast a shadow over the legitimacy of the royal line. When Louis X died in 1316, without a surviving male heir from his second marriage, his son, John I, lived only a few days. It led to a succession crisis. The French nobles invoked an old Salic law to prevent Louis's daughter Jean, from his marriage to the disgraced Margaret, from inheriting the throne, arguing a woman couldn't rule France. This principle would later be a contributing factor to the 100 Years' War with England, as English kings had claims through female lines. All from a few embroidered purses and some very reckless royal rendezvous. Number 1. The fiery queen who loved her uncle, maybe, and defied a king. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most powerful and fascinating women of the Middle Ages. Queen of France, then Queen of England, Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, she was a force of nature. And her life was packed with adventure, power plays, and of course, scandal. One of the earliest and juiciest bits of gossip concerned her relationship with her own uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch, during the Second Crusade. In 1147, a young Eleanor, then Queen of France, and married to the pious but rather dull King Louis VII, embarked on the Second Crusade. This was already a bit unusual for a queen, but Eleanor was no ordinary queen. She brought her own Aquitanian vassals, and was reportedly quite the figure dressed in armor, though probably not fighting. The crusade itself was a bit of a disaster, but the stopover in Antioch in 1148 provided plenty of drama. Antioch was ruled by Raymond of Poitiers, Eleanor's handsome, charming, and worldly uncle, her father's brother. He was only about 10 years older than her. Raymond welcomed Eleanor and Louis lavishly. While Louis was focused on religious pilgrimage and ill-defined military goals, Eleanor and Raymond apparently hit it off splendidly. They spent a lot of time together, speaking in their native Occitan language, which Louis didn't understand well, discussing politics, strategy for the crusade, and the future of Aquitaine. Rumors started to fly. Contemporary chroniclers, like William of Tyre and John of Salisbury, who were not always fans of Eleanor, hinted that their relationship was too close, too affectionate. They whispered that Eleanor was overly fond of her uncle and that their intimacy went beyond what was proper for an uncle and niece, especially a married queen. Some even suggested an incestuous affair. Eleanor, for her part, seemed genuinely impressed by Raymond's political acumen and his plans for the crusade, which involved attacking Aleppo rather than heading straight for Jerusalem as Louis wanted. She publicly supported Raymond's strategy, which put her in direct conflict with her husband, King Louis. This disagreement became a huge public row. Eleanor was furious with Louis's lack of strategic vision and his general piety over pragmatism approach. Things got so heated that Eleanor reportedly declared she wanted an annulment from Louis, stunning everyone. She even brought up the fact that she and Louis were too closely related. Fourth cousins once removed a common get-out-of-marriage-free card if you needed one. Was this political frustration boiling over, or was there a more personal reason, perhaps fueled by her admiration for Raymond? The chroniclers lapped it up. John of Salisbury wrote that Raymond had designs on the Queen, and that she was prepared to consent. William of Tyre spoke of their familiarity breeding suspicion. Whether they actually had a physical affair is impossible to prove definitively. It could have been a deep emotional connection and political alliance that was deliberately misinterpreted by scandal-mongering chroniclers or by Louis' supporters who wanted to discredit Eleanor. Or it could have been true. The very idea of a queen openly defying her king on crusade and allegedly having an affair with her uncle was explosive. Louis VII was horrified by Eleanor's behavior and her demand for an annulment. He was also deeply suspicious of her relationship with Raymond. He basically dragged Eleanor away from Antioch against her will, forcing her to continue on to Jerusalem. The damage to their marriage was severe. They did stay together for a few more years and even had another daughter, but the trust and affection, if there ever was much from Eleanor's side, were gone. In 1152, their marriage was finally annulled, officially, on the grounds of consanguinity. Just a few weeks later, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy, who soon became King Henry II of England. This marriage would create its own legendary sagas of passion, betrayal, and power struggles. But the Antioch episode remained a significant scandal in Eleanor's early life. It established her reputation as a strong-willed, independent woman who was not afraid to challenge authority, even her kingly husband's. It also painted her as a woman of passionate and perhaps unconventional affections. Whether or not she truly had an affair with Raymond, the rumors themselves were enough to set tongues wagging across Christendom and add another layer to the legend of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen who dared